A luta continua. He's a Nigerian American leading a decades-old fight to give America's capital the autonomy it craves.
D.C. residents are like people all over America. In fact, more of us live here than in Vermont or Wyoming.
And everyone who lives there has 2 senators. Here, we have none.
Not only that, Congress can overturn our local laws and overrule our local funding.
Born to Nigerian parents in the US, Dr. Adeoye Owolewa, or Representative Oye as he is popularly known, is leading the charge to make the District of Columbia or Washington D.C. America's 51st state.
Because we're not a state, we have a delegate position and also the U.S. representative role that I'm in right now, which is unseated, non-voting because we're not a state. So D.C Statehood, we're fighting for congressional representation. We're fighting for self-autonomy, control over our laws and our budget and our resources. And my daily routine is to basically fight for that, but also help fill in the holes in DC that we're missing because we're not a state.
Representative Oye will fill us in on what residents of Washington, D.C. stand to gain from becoming America's 51st state. And new neighbor alert. We have a new neighbor in the sky. A mini-moon that's only available for a couple of months. We'll tell you why. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe, and this is the A55 Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the A55 Podcast. We are back from our break with more captivating and inspiring conversations with Africans both at home and in the diaspora. So make sure you stay with us throughout this season and don't miss an episode. I'm just curious though, what have you been up to while we were away? Drop us a line on our social media platforms and tell us what you've been up to. I know some of you managed to catch up on past episodes of the podcast on our YouTube channel, for which we are grateful. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, just look for the A55 Podcast on YouTube and subscribe. And guess what? We are finally on Threads. You know, Instagram's cousin or sibling, whichever it is. You know what I'm talking about. Follow us over there too. Let's get this show going. Here's Gertrude Davison Tete with our first African proverb of the season.
Between true friends, even water drunk together is sweet enough.
Thanks, Gertrude, and I hope the conversations we share together on this show are sweet enough for you, as they are for us here at A55. Pop quiz time. If I were to ask you what's the capital of the United States, you'd probably answer without hesitation that it's Washington, D.C., and you'd be 100% right. But did you know that D.C. isn't one of the 50 states that make up the union that is the United States of America? Why, you ask? Because of a clause in the American Constitution that gave Congress power over the city that is the federal capital. But you know, D.C. wasn't always America's capital. In fact, America's first president, George Washington, first took office in New York City before the capital was moved to Philadelphia, where it remained for a decade. Washington, D.C. was founded as the capital in 1790 as a compromise. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution instructed that the seat of government be a, quote, district not exceeding 10 miles square, over which Congress would exercise exclusive legislation, unquote. The reason for this arrangement, as spelled out by James Madison, one of America's founding fathers and 4th president, was having an isolated district would prevent any state from wielding too much power by virtue of being home to the national government, and this effectively stripped D.C. of representation in Congress. But since 1980, D.C.'s residents have been advocating for congressional representation through statehood. That fight started nearly 2 decades after residents of D.C. were allowed to vote in national elections. 4 decades on, the fight for D.C. statehood is gaining momentum, and leading the charge is a young Nigerian American, Dr. Adeoye Owolewa, or Representative Oye as he is popularly known. Besides being of Nigerian heritage, Representative Oye wasn't even born in Washington, D.C. He was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and only moved to D.C. after he completed his doctorate in pharmacy studies. A trained pharmacist by profession, Representative Oye's foray into local elected office was essentially on a dare. Shortly after his win, he went on to win the race to become the District of Columbia's representative to Congress. Considering the fact that DC's fight for statehood has been ongoing for over 4 decades, with a possible resolution still out of sight, What attracted Representative Owolewa to this position? And since taking on this task, has he succeeded in winning others over to DC's cause? Representative Owolewa joins me in a bit with some answers. So Representative Owolewa, thank you so much for joining us on the A55 podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Great. I'm happy you've been able to join us. Okay, I'm sure people are wondering, I'm saying Representative Owolewa, yes, because you are DC's representative for the House of Representatives in Congress.
Yes, sir.
But I'm curious, you know how African parents usually like us to do one thing because parents know best? But you are a pharmacist and now you are an elected official in public office. I'm just curious, how did the journey start? Did your parents really want you to do pharmacy or politics, or these two are just things you were interested in?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. My mom and daddy, they both separately came from Nigeria, two different parts. Mom grew up in Oyo State, my dad grew up in Kwara State. They separately met in the United States in Boston, Massachusetts, actually. And then they decided to meet, stay there, and raise me and my four other siblings. They pushed me with the identity. I have a Nigerian first name, Nigerian last name. They didn't know I was going to get into politics, obviously, right, with a name like that. But they also pushed me to pursue like a higher and professional career and also get back in the community. So when I was in 10th grade, I knew I wanted to be an engineer, but physics got in the way. So when I told my mom and dad that I didn't want to be an engineer anymore, they looked at me like, what are you going to do the rest of your life at age 15? So I was blessed enough to have my parents who had friends who were in other careers that they were able to let me shadow them and look around with them. And then I fell in love with pharmacy. And so I went to Northeastern University just like my parents did years before. And I graduated my doctorate of pharmacy by age 24. And after that, I moved to D.C.
So why D.C. though? That's also the question I was curious about, because you were raised in Boston. Why move to D.C.? You could have practiced in Boston, I'm sure.
That's true. To be honest, I'll give you the honest answer. I was done with the snow. All right? I was born in the snow, and when I got a chance to move away from it, I did. I visited Howard University at my cousin's graduation, and I fell in love with the place, and the rest was history. 2 days after graduation, I was in the District of Columbia, and I haven't looked back since.
That's interesting. And then was this planned or was this a coincidence? Because reading about you, I realized you were elected to the D.C Advisory Neighborhood Commission in, I think, 2018, which would be about 4 years since you moved to D.C. Was it planned or was it?
It was never planned. Growing up, my parents were watching politics and watching people run for office. And my very first election was George W. Bush versus John Kerry. Two white men that don't look like my parents, don't talk like my parents, that didn't reflect anything that I was seeing around me growing up in the neighborhood. So I never thought I was going to be able to run for office. But when I moved to D.C., I started volunteering with kids, getting kids interested in science careers, bringing forth that early exposure that I took advantage of and really bring that to the kids here in D.C. And a local politician, she recommended me to get into the community, look into what was going on. And when I finally moved to Southeast Washington, D.C., I went to my very first Advisory Neighborhood Commission. And to be honest, I didn't like the way it was handled. I didn't like the way people were talking to each other. I didn't really think that the conversations were always so productive. And even most, I've seen the elderly be disrespected by our previously electorates. And my upbringing kind of didn't allow me to sit well with that. And I was talking in the back of the room, saying how unprofessional and how much things needed to change. And somebody turned around and said, if you're so much better, then why don't you run? And that's what we did. You can never dare a Nigerian American to do something. Yeah. And we did it. We worked hard and we won by one single vote.
Wow. One vote.
One vote in that race.
So it could have gone the other way easily.
No, maybe none of this would have happened if it did. So the power of one vote, the power of not taking any person or any interaction for granted really set course, my political life.
And do you know how come it was that close that you had to beat the other person by just one vote?
Well, at the time, I was brand new to politics. I didn't know anything, but I learned a lot of things along the way. The value of relationships, the value of track record, the value of people know who you are. I just jumped into this neighborhood and I wanted to make a difference. But more importantly, the value of making sure every interaction is important, make sure people feel heard, and also following through on your promise. I made a lot of promises when I was running for office, and I saw to it that eventually all those commitments were either answered, addressed, or at least people felt they were getting good representation. And now, being in an elected office, I help inspire and coach other people to run for office, and I don't charge them a dime. I just want to tell them what I've learned. I want to tell them what I could have done better, and also some things that actually worked for me. And really trying to make sure I may be the first Nigerian American, but not be the last.
I want to go now into your House of Representative job, but you just said something that caught my attention, that you're coaching others. Yeah. Where does this love for civic duty, public office thing come from? Because I think you have someone is it your great grandmother or grandfather or so who was in public office in Nigeria, correct?
Absolutely. Well, both lines of my family come from a group of leaders, whether they're elected or not, appointed or not. But in particularly, my grandmother on my mom's side, Adeoye Owolewa, was the second female senior advocate in Nigerian history, which is, really, really, really groundbreaking in itself. We're talking about eras where women weren't always allowed to lead. And also she was married at the time. So having, a spouse who was supportive in Nigeria. My grandfather was a doctor, and he was also a leader in his own right. Then on my dad's side, his parents were also leaders of the community, and it trickled down to their next generation, which was my parents. My daddy still is a leader in the community in Massachusetts and beyond. And my mom is always a civil servant, whether it's getting us into colleges, helping us with any issues we have in school, and not just inside the household, but the entire community as a whole. Yeah. So coming to DC, it was just continuing my parents' values, continuing the things we grew up with and things they grew up with, to the point that it was second nature to me, and it allowed me to take things to the next level.
So more like giving credence to the saying, Nigerian they carry last. So I like that.
Absolutely.
So now let's talk about being DC's rep for the House of Representatives in Congress. From what I understand, it's not a paid position. So the first thing I was wondering, so why would someone take on all this stress, especially when it's not a paid position? You must really be either interested or passionate about it, or something must be moving you to want to take up this position.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, guys. DC is different than all other parts of this country, of the United States. This country, we're not a state, and because we're not a state, we have a delegate position who's someone I'm very close to, Congresswoman Norton, and also the U.S. Representative role that I'm in right now, which is unseated, non-voting because we're not a state, but we also have the duty of carrying the fight for D.C Statehood. With my background, whether it's being born in another state, parents being born in another country, I've been blessed to have a somewhat larger audience that I could potentially speak to. But with the work that I've been able to do in the community as well, has been able to make that much of an impact. So D.C. Statehood, we're fighting for congressional representation. We're fighting for self-autonomy, control over our laws and our budget and our resources. And my daily routine is to basically fight for that, but also help fill in the holes in DC that we're missing because we're not a state. So it's not just talking the talk, it's also walking into. We've been doing a bunch of initiatives and programs to help improve the quality of life of district residents.
So do you get to be on the floor of the House with the other representatives, the 400 plus representatives?
So typically not, especially now in the GOP-controlled or Republican-controlled Congress. But there are opportunities to work with our Congressman Norton, to lobby and affiliate and attach ourselves to other congressional members. So we've been able to have an impact even without being in committees and things like that. So we really try to maximize our opportunity. We're Nigerian Americans. If there's a door a little bit cracked, we'll figure it out. If the door is locked, we go through the window. And I've been able to use a lot of those things that I've learned, I've seen other people do, to make the most out of this opportunity.
Okay, so your position, if I'm correct, is more or less like what the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and co. also their reps also do.
For like Puerto Rico side, yes. Yes.
So, DC's statehood, which you've been championing, and from my research, apparently DC even only was allowed to vote in, I think, 1961 in national elections, and it's a constitutional issue from what I've gathered. So, I mean, how do you see this playing out? Because you're not the first who's been appointed as, DC's rep in the House of Representatives. So obviously, this fight has been going on for a while now. How do you see it playing out? Does it need like a constitutional amendment or what?
So in DC, as elected into this role, what we're pushing for is the Tennessee plan, which is traditionally the House passes a bill, the Senate passes a bill, and the president signs the legislation. Now, in the 116th, 117th Congress, which is just a few years ago, we actually got that first step. It was a landmark time where we were able to pass the House of Representatives the bill to allow DC to become the 51st state. Now, the Senate has been a barrier. We have 46 co-sponsors, so we're just about there. And some people on the other side say they want to be a constitutional amendment, which would increase the voting threshold to 66 or so. But we in DC, we favor 51 votes, like just getting us up to the hump. And right now we have a president, Joe Biden, that does support D.C. Statehood. So literally, if the Congress passed it and the Senate passed it, we can actually start working to become a state. I believe we're a few years away from that actually happening. We have a Democratic nominee for president, Kamala Harris, who supports D.C. Statehood. But it's my job to make sure people all across the country know about statehood. They know how more voting representation from DC will help impact their lives. We make sure that once we have the numbers in terms of supporters in both sides of Congress and in the presidency, that becomes a priority for them to pass it, because it's going to take a lot of energy to make DC a state, but we have enough energy now than we ever had before to really make this happen.
And from your interactions with people, both in Congress and on the road, because I see you've been touring around as well and talking about DC Statehood, what's the reception been like so far?
So it's been mostly positive. I think the two most common responses is that I'm supportive of it or I need to know more about it. We haven't received that much pushback from the people wise. Now, when it comes to legislators and Congress members, often they have talking points and they have their own reasons why they want to keep DC less powerful than their area, right?
What are some of those reasons?
Well, some people want to, they see DC being a mostly Democratic city. We have traditionally voted Democratic, but there's no reason why they can't convince us, right? Rather than convincing us, they want to disenfranchise us. When Alaska and Hawaii, the most two recent states were admitted to the Union, they thought Hawaii was going to be the Republican side and then Alaska was going to be the Democratic side. Now, with time, it flipped. So now Republicans actually are a majority of the Alaskan congressional legislature, and Democrats are in office in Hawaii. But rather than take that risk and try to convince us that their side is the best route, they rather just keep our votes away. So that is typically the reason why. Now, they'll disguise it saying that they don't want to fit another star on the flag, or we don't have enough car lots in DC, but it really comes down to power. So, but when we activate their constituents, like when I went to West Virginia and got a DC Statehood resolution introduced, then it allows folks in other areas who may be voting Republican, maybe voting Democrat, to see this as a fairness issue and more of an awareness versus a convincing proposition.
But for residents of DC specifically, what benefits do they get if DC becomes a state?
DC would immediately improve our quality of life when we become a state. There is no part of being in DC that's not impacted by not being a state. Now, let's push to the side the congressional vote. We don't have final say of our laws. We have a public safety bill recently that got overturned by Congress. That's unprecedented. We passed our own law and Congress said we don't like that law because they want to score political points. We had a needle exchange program in the 90s that would have reduced the incidence of AIDS, and HIV, and hepatitis, but Congress stripped that. We talking about marijuana laws. All across the country, cannabis has been decriminalized. Most recently in Maryland, Governor Wes Moore expunged all cannabis-related convictions.
Yeah.
In D.C., not only are we unable to expunge these crimes, not only are we unable to fully decriminalize and start taxing cannabis sales, we have riders in the budget, which is basically congressional bans on us selling marijuana. So we're unable to even tap into that market value. We're unable to have restorative justice in communities that are been hit hard by a war on drugs. And last but not least, we're unable to expunge, like compared to our neighbors in Maryland, Virginia. So whether you care about criminal justice, whether you care about our budget, whether you care about our ability to pass our own laws and keep it as such, we're unable to do so because we're not a state. So once we become a state, we'll be able to have full control of our lives and our resources.
So, meaning your budget is determined by Congress?
Very much so. So the mayor and the council, we pass our own budget, but technically Congress can come in and say, we disapprove of your budget. So Congress members who can't even do this in their own hometowns, can't even impact anything because they're federal, can actually thumb the needle on our autonomy and legislative process and make life harder for us, even though we never elected any of them.
So, what's the next step? I know you say you've cleared one hurdle in Congress. What would it take to get to the finish line to get DC the statehood you've been fighting for?
Yeah, we need more support in the Senate, right? As I mentioned to you before, we passed in the House, but every cycle we have to reintroduce it if it doesn't pass. So it doesn't become law unless it passes all three of them at the same time. So we had to reintroduce it because the bill technically died in the Senate, so we had to make sure we increase our support over there. But my job, like I said before, going to all these other states, talking on platforms like yours, nationalizing and globalizing this conversation about statehood, because once we start having external pressure, whether it's from other states or other countries, then it helps us move the needle a little bit more. So, talking to you today helps us increase the awareness. And not just for me specifically, but just also for American democracy. In this current electoral process, we keep hearing democracy's on the line, or we keep hearing about voter suppression. We keep hearing about, the racial divide amongst opportunities, and including DC Statehood into these conversations help us carry this message forward.
Okay, so then we wish you the best with that. But and it's an interesting conversation, because if you're not in America, when you hear 50 states, you automatically assume DC is one of those 50 states because it's the nation's capital. But
exactly,
getting in and realizing that no, it's actually not, kind of throws you off a bit and makes you wonder. But apart from fighting for DC statehood, you're also using your science background and your pharmacy to help your community. I understand you are introducing kids to STEM education. Why is that important for you to do? Because they're kids, I guess, elementary school kids.
Yeah, the reason why it was so important for me to really expose young people to STEM careers is really about my makeup, like how I grew up, and also some of the things that I saw in college. So as I mentioned before, my mom and dad, my mom is a civil engineer, my dad's a medical technologist. Both STEM careers. I was able to be raised in a household that was full in STEM. And then when you just see the Nigerian American population, we really excel in academia, we excel in science careers, we excel in pretty much everything. But more importantly, it started with that drive and early commitment to professionalism and excellence. Moving to Southeast Washington, D.C., I saw so many kids that looked like me, but didn't have that same push. Being in college, I was the only Black male to graduate out of my 150-person class in pharmacy school. And when you don't see people that look like you, when you don't see teachers that look like you, when you only found out about pharmacy in about 10th or 11th grade, it was really easy to be in a different life. And coming to DC, I just saw an opportunity. If I can expose these young kids at grades 1, 2, 3, maybe they can carry that with them longer. Maybe when they start applying to university, they won't be hearing about pharmacy when they're a freshman in college. I had so many people when I was in college tell me, "Oh man, if I knew, I would have been in your class." But at the time, there was no way to transfer into my class. Like you had to know what you were applying for to be into that. So that means you had to be exposed to it. And a lot of my classmates, regardless of their race, whether they're Indian, white, or Asian, they had siblings who were pharmacists. I'm the 4th out of 5 in my family. My sister's a pathologist. I have a brother who's a lawyer. I have another sibling who's a consultant. But my younger brother's a pharmacist.
Okay.
If it wasn't for me, he probably could have gone to pharmacy school.
Yeah.
But he may not have known about pharmacy to go to pharmacy school. And I think it's important to pass it down because I understand what pharmacy's done to my life economically, what it's done to my siblings in terms of a role model. And where we're at in the marginalized community in Southeast Washington, D.C., we probably rank last compared to other wards in certain aspects economically. I know the impact of having an older sibling not becoming a pharmacist or becoming an engineer or becoming a medical doctor. They can buy their parents' home. They can help their younger siblings. They can inspire their younger siblings to become science careers. And that can, within a generation, can help transform our community. And that's kind of what inspired me to do, and it continues to inspire me today to continue the work even as a representative.
So there's that connection that gives you that platform, I guess, to say that you can help spread the gospel, if I can put it that way, of pharmacy to the kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, though, now I'm wondering, from pharmacy to elected office, why does state keep coming into my head? I almost said state elected office, but you're still fighting for that.
Good.
So.
Bring it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe I'm manifesting. Who knows? What's next for Oye? Do you see yourself moving more inwards towards politics for the future, or do you see sticking with the science and STEM education thing that you're doing in the pharmacy and all that?
Yeah, it's so hard to think about the future because the present is like living my dream, right? I never thought I was going to be in politics. No one that looked like me or sounded like me has ever run for office. Being in D.C., I'm proud of the diversity of what makes up the District of Columbia, but they always told me growing up that a name like yours couldn't get elected. So to see me be lucky enough to be in this position and then help other people who otherwise didn't have beliefs in themselves have it for themselves is a dream come true. Now, I love this political journey. I mean, I've been able to make my own way. I've been able to bring the Nigerianness into it. I've been able to bring the pharmacy into this. I've been able to bring the grassroots advisory neighborhood commissioner into this role. And it's just been such a whirlwind. Now, I don't know what's going to happen for me in the near future. I mean, people are telling me I maximize the opportunities in this role, but every single day I've been focused on just winning that day. Just if I can learn something, if I can teach something, if I can do something every single day, then maybe a few weeks later, I'll look back and be really proud of myself. Like, I'm really excited about being on this platform. I mean, I never thought that people would even care about the work that I'm doing. But seeing the impact I have on others, whether it's helping returning citizens get their records cleared and get jobs to improve our public safety, whether it's teaching local and minority and women business owners about how to get contracts, certifications, and grants to bring that federal and local money into our communities, has been something that I've been really proud of. To have offices full of Kenyans and Nigerians and giving people their first chance and first jobs in this public service sphere has been something that I would never forget and I'll cherish for the rest of my life. So, I'm just excited to see other people's futures as I am of guessing what my own is going to be.
That's great. Well said. And are you on the ballot again this November?
Yes, sir. We're on the ballot this November. This rolls every 2 years, so you never stop getting out there, which is like good and bad. But yeah, we're on the ballot on November 5th. We have an opponent this time, so we're working really hard to finish out strong.
All right. Well, Nigerian to carry last, so we wish you all the very best with that.
Thank you.
To learn more about Representative Oye's work for the residents of DC and the fight for DC statehood, check out our show notes for a link to his website. And we do wish him the very best in the upcoming elections in November and with the fight for DC statehood. Now, the Earth, as far as we know, has one moon, unlike some other planets in our solar system. But for the next couple of months, there will be a second moon of sorts in our sky. Before You Go is next. And before you go, I bet many of us can rattle off the names of the planets in our solar system, but do you know how many moons each planet has? The Earth, our planet, has one moon, but Mercury and Venus have none. Saturn, according to NASA, has 146 moons as of June last year. That's 51 more moons than Jupiter, which has the second most known moons, 95. But from September 29 till about November 24, our planet will have a second moon of sorts. A mini-moon is what scientists and astronomers are calling it. You see, it's not exactly a moon. It's an asteroid which is about 33 feet in size and was pulled into our atmosphere by our planet's gravitational force.
These objects come from the solar system at a relatively slow speed, around 1 kilometer per second or 3,600 kilometers per hour. The Earth's gravitational pull is sufficient to capture them temporarily, resulting in a mini-moon.
The asteroid, which is named 2024 PT5, was first spotted in August by astronomers using a powerful telescope located in Sutherland, South Africa. And if this is the first time you're hearing about a mini-moon in our sky, well, that's because astronomers say even though it's a common occurrence, these mini-moons are too small to see with the naked eye. Here's Casey DeRue, an associate professor at the University of Iowa.
It is really small. So we have been able to find this using scientific telescopes, and it is in orbit around us. So unless you happen to have, say, 3-foot diameter telescope lying around in your backyard, you'll be out of luck.
Well, guess when the last mini-moon was spotted? In 2020. And we're not likely to see this one called 2024 PT5 for another 30 years.
So we discovered it on August 7th. It had already slungshot by Earth. And then we'll do this sort of lazy orbit where it forms sort of an ellipse or like a distended circle. And then we'll go through a brief period where it's gravitationally bound or under most under the influence of Earth's gravity from about September 29th until November 25th. So it'll stick around until Thanksgiving, and then it'll carry on its merry way for another 30 years until we interact with it again.
I guess I need to make some astronomer friends before 2055 so that I can join them in their search for 2024 PT5 when it comes right back to our atmosphere. Anyway, that's our show for today. Thanks for joining us for this very first episode of our second season. And thanks to Representative Oye for joining us. Special thanks to my producer, Gertrude Ntete, and Bright Dra, our social media coordinator. If you're enjoying this podcast, which I know you do, can you spare a moment to rate our show? It will help make our show more visible to other podcast lovers. And of course, make sure you recommend it to someone who loves podcasts too. Our theme music is Sunshine Blues by Kobe Spikey. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Have a great weekend, and let's do this again 2 Fridays from now.